My pleasure.
Hello, good afternoon.
All right, so let me begin with Professor Iraki. Now, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger represented 16% of ECOWAS's 424 million population and also 7% of its economy. How do you assess the immediate economic shock from the fallout?
I feel like if you have a family of 5 or 6 or 10 children and 2 or 3 of them leave home, you're going to feel the effect. So one of the biggest advantages of ECOWAS is that there are a number of prayers, and those prayers work together. They trade with one another. There's a rate of movement. You can move from one country to another. So when 3 countries leave this ECOWAS region, it is going to be felt in terms of reduced trade, in terms of reduced economies of scale. So at the end of the day, even those who are going to be left are going to feel lonely, like the children who have been left behind by siblings who have left and gone somewhere else. So I think whether you are reading or not, or whether you are remaining in the ECOWAS, the fact that some of the ECOWAS members have left is going to be felt. It might be felt in terms of rising costs, in terms of a lot of reduced labor, because some people not being able to move from one country to another, and possibly rising prices.
Okay. And now let's hear your thoughts, Doctor. Let's hear your thoughts on, the fallout or the exit of these 3 countries, from ECOWAS, and how you feel it will affect trade and also some African countries' economy.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. And I think it bears reminding that ECOWAS is Africa's biggest regional economic community. And of course, the foremost intention of a regional economic community is to foster trade. So there will be impacts of this exit on trade. The impacts will be most large for the relationship between the AES countries and the Anglophone ECOWAS countries, such as Nigeria and Ghana, as well as Sierra Leone, Liberia. And the reason for this is because ECOWAS is a customs union. That means that members within the union have essentially tariff-free trade with each other, and then they impose a common external tariff for outside members, so for non-ECOWAS members. Now, the 3 AES countries have left ECOWAS, but they have not yet left the Francophone West African Economic and Monetary Union. So they're still within that particular customs union. So as I said, the impacts will be largest in terms of trade with the Anglophone ECOWAS countries. So for instance, now there will be a higher tariffs between the ECOWAS and non-ECOWAS countries. There's also an ECOWAS community levy. This is about 0.5% tax that's imposed on goods from non-ECOWAS member states, and that money is used predominantly to fund the ECOWAS budget. It makes up almost 90% of the ECOWAS budget. So there'll be substantive impacts on tariffs and taxes. And then we can also think about movement of people, particularly thinking about cross-border trade, very integrated between northern Ghana and Burkina Faso, for instance, obviously between Niger and Nigeria. And ECOWAS had a free movement of people protocol. The AES has introduced its own passport, but there's no indication that ECOWAS
Dr. Resnick,
will accept
I sincerely apologize for cutting you off, but we need to go on a quick break. We'll be back in a bit. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with us on the conversation. Now, just before we went on the break, we were discussing the ECOWAS rift and how the 3 countries that have actually left ECOWAS might push food prices even higher. And we had Professor Iraki and Dr. Danielle Resnick speaking to us. Dr. Resnick, thank you for staying with us. Sincerely apologize once again for, cutting you off earlier. You're about wrapping up on your thoughts on how it will impact, trade and also the economy in Africa just before we went on that break.
Yes, I was just alluding to the fact that in addition to the taxes and tariff rates, there's also some, discussion about the impacts on free movement of people and how that will affect, the tremendous amount of cross-border trade between ECOWAS and non-ECOWAS countries. and whether the new AES passport that was launched by the three juntas will be recognized in future by ECOWAS, and vice versa, whether AES countries will recognize the ECOWAS passport. That's something that I think is on many people's mind, particularly business people and traders in the region.
Okay. Now, reports actually indicate that, the cost of daily nutritious diet in the Sahel Alliance is 110% higher than the region's daily minimum wage. Are there urgent steps that are needed to address the plight of the 7.5 million people that are now in crisis?
So those figures, mostly coming from the Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Food Program, were actually prior to the AES exit. So those were already elevated because of the climate impacts in the region, and of course the conflict security issues, and the high import dependence of the three Sahel countries on agricultural and food products. So going forward, we anticipate that these trends will be exacerbated for many of the reasons we already noted, particularly for food products that are traded in the region. The key steps that are typically taken to cushion populations are things like cash transfer programs, like supporting school meals programs, so at least ensuring that children are receiving healthy, nutritious foods through the education system, and particularly different types of food aid programs. These will be difficult, though, to sustain. It's quite a resource scarce environment that we're in at the moment globally, and so ensuring that governments have sufficient finance to support those programs will be very tricky in these three countries, which are devoting a big part of their budgets to defense and military expenditure.
All right. Now let's come back to you, Professor Iraki. Now, Dr. Resnick did talk about, the WTO tariff rates, and we know that, there would be a reverting to WTO tariff rates, after enjoying duty-free intra-ECOWAS trade since 2015. So how will this affect the competitiveness of agricultural and manufactured imports from the Sahel Alliance?
See, if you look at the countries that form ECOWAS, they're integrated. They treat with one another. They are roads, they are rail. There's movement of people from one country to another. So by some countries leaving out, we are going to reduce the competitiveness of those countries because they are sharing fewer resources. They are sharing a smaller labor market. And I suspect that each of these countries is going to start working by itself instead of working together or working in a group. So the competitiveness of those countries is going to be reduced. And as I said earlier, that is going to be reflected in higher costs of goods, of services, of transport, and other facilitation of trade among those regions. So everybody is going to feel the effect.
So what is your take, on the fact that the exit means losing access to major ports, like the Tema and also the Lagos ports?
It's interesting that these three countries that are leaving ECOWAS are ad-rocked. That is quite surprising because they cannot start transporting their goods towards the north, towards the Mediterranean Sea. They must come to the Atlantic. So by leaving, they may end up paying higher costs for transport to go through Tema or go through other ports. And you can be sure that by paying more to facilitate transport, then the consumers are going to feel the effect. And that's why I'm saying at the end of the day, the goods to these three countries are going to go up. The consumers are going to pay more. That may reduce the flow of trade, and that at the end of the day will make their exit very costly. So if I were to be asked, I would request them to use that window of opportunity to stay instead of leaving, because the cost of leaving is higher than the cost of staying in.
All right. Now, Dr. Resnick, can you speak to what Professor Iraki said about, consumers needing to pay more, because we know that with this, there would be new custom levies and also the reversion of higher WTO tariff rates. So what price increases could consumers face when importing essential food items?
Yeah, so I think some of the products that will be most affected are those where there was heavy trade, particularly between the AES and the non-AES ECOWAS countries. Things like tomatoes and livestock from Burkina Faso coming into Ghana. For instance, Ghana was one of the major import markets for Burkinabe tomatoes. Similar relationship between Niger and Nigeria. Onions were a key export from Niger into Nigeria. The ECOWAS external levy is quite high on onions. It's 35%. That's seen as a strategic good, so it has the highest tariff rate. So Niger is going to face a real high import tariff now on that particular commodity. And in turn, Nigerians, for instance, will face a higher cost for onions unless, sourcing occurs elsewhere. So my expectation is that there will be, as Professor Iraki said, an substantial increase in prices for certain agricultural products. You could also think that there may be some increases also for agro-processing in the Sahel countries. Niger, for instance, imports a majority of its electricity from Nigeria, and that's used by processors, to make some of the finished foods that we eat, fruit juices, bread, tomato paste, and so the cost of energy is going to be much higher for processors in the Sahel states.
All right, Dr. Resnick, do you still think that, the cost of, the food and onions and also energy would be, exacerbated some more, considering the fact that the Republic of Niger has actually begun enforcing restrictions on Nigerians traveling with their ECOWAS passports into the country?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think as Professor Iraki noted, more competition amongst these countries is obviously not going to facilitate economic integration. So particularly, yes, for small-scale traders, but also, larger business companies trying to work between the two regions, this increases the cost of business. And it's typically the consumers that bear the brunt of those higher costs.
All right, now, Professor Iraki, we've seen actually reports that, key projects like the Lagos-Abidjan Corridor and also the Dakar-Bamako Railway are at risk. Now, what long-term impacts could delays in these initiatives have on regional connectivity and economic growth?
If you look at what is happening in the background of Africa Free Trade Area, it's one of Africa's best initiatives in the last 50 years, coming up with the Africa Free Trade Area. Now, if you now stop building railways, building roads, which interconnects African countries so that they trade more, then you are going to have a ripple effect across that region. So if you stop building rails, you stop building roads, you stop connecting countries, you stop connecting traders, you stop connecting ideas, you stop connecting people who trade one another, then the long-term effect is not just going to be felt in West Africa, it is going to be felt in the rest of Africa. In fact, stopping such initiatives is defining the African free trade area dream. I've been to West Africa, and I've always been impressed by the way people can move from one West African country to another for 6 months, for trade, for education. So if you can stop such initiatives, it's a very big setback to African free trade area, and we don't expect that to be the way that other African countries should follow. I wish those countries can reconsider so that the African free trade area dream can be realized, starting with the ECOWAS, then you go to East African Community and other region blocks. But eventually, we talk of really Africa free trade area connected with one another, more trade, so that in the long run, we depend more on trade, not foreign aid.
Okay. Dr. Resnick, you heard Professor Iraki saying that, Africa free trade area needs to be realized, and he wished that the country, the countries that have actually exited ECOWAS could reconsider. Now, speak to us about your thoughts on these key projects like the Lagos-Abidjan Corridor and also the Dakar-Bamako Railway, and its risks of if it's not completed.
Well, not much to add from what Professor Iraki already eloquently explained. The risks to transport and interconnection are obvious if these are not completed, and I think really, make the African continental free trade area, very much start to become more of an aspiration than a reality that many countries are committed to. So I think any types of these, there was the ECOWAS Power Project, there's many different ECOWAS health initiatives that were going on in the region. All of these are at risk of leaving out these Sahel countries in particular, which, unfortunately are ones that could have been the biggest beneficiaries of these projects.
Oh, okay. Now, still on this, Dr. Resnick, with almost 60% of Burkina Faso's vegetable exports and also 90% of its live animal exports going to, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, what are the likely repercussions for both exporters and their key trading partners?
Well, as noted earlier, the likely repercussions are now facing higher tariff rates, right? So for, vegetables exported from Burkina into Ghana, Burkina will now face the common external tariff for those goods. And these are quite nuanced for different products. So you really need a very detailed kind of empirical analysis for each product that you're talking about. But overall, they'll face a higher tariff rate. And so, importers in Ghana, for instance, will be needing to pay that higher cost unless they're going to source elsewhere. And that higher cost in the tariffs will be most likely passed on to consumers. And that may lead consumers to substitute to other different products. So thereby further diminishing the market for Burkina Faso vegetable exports. There's also some implications on nutrition as well. Yeah. A lot of the AES countries import a lot of their wheat flour and edible oils from the other ECOWAS countries. And those two foods are the ones that are fortified with vitamin A and iron in these three AES countries. Those are essential to deal with things like blindness and anemia. But if these products become more expensive in the Sahel countries as well, processors are going to be much more reluctant to pay vitamin and premix costs to continue fortifying. So there's some real nutritional implications for the populations in the Sahel.
All right. Now, we'll still talk about nutrition in a bit, but then Professor Iraki, Dr. Resnick talked about earlier, she mentioned about energy security, which is also as important. Now, the exclusion from the West African Power Pool, that's WAP, raises alarms as well. How do you think that the fragmented electricity supplies will affect not only the AES states, but also the energy security of neighboring ECOWAS countries?
If you come to East Africa, that's one of our dreams, that we are going to have an energy pool. So that if some countries have more energy, it is exported to the countries that have energy deficits. So if these three countries are removed from the energy pool, one of the consequences immediate would be rise in tariffs. Energy will become more costly. If energy is costly, then that has an equal effect on the economy. Because if you look at the calculation of inflation in any country, energy is always a very big input. So we are saying that food is going to be costly, energy is going to be costly. So at the end of the day, all the citizens of that country are going to start suffering because of inflation. And I don't think that is what any political leader, that is what any consumer, that is what any policymaker is looking for. So I still think that withdrawing from ECOWAS for these three countries was a wrong economic decision. It may make political sense, but it does not make economic sense.
Okay. Dr. Resnick, let's quickly touch on, migration. According to reports, over 1.3 million Burkinabés and 500,000 Malians, are residing in Cote d'Ivoire under the ECOWAS Freedom of Movement Protocol. What humanitarian challenges might emerge, as Sahelexit disrupts established migration channels?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a worry of particularly Burkinabe migrants in Cote d'Ivoire. There were some protests even in Cote d'Ivoire about the exits. I mean, I think in the short term, I think there will be an effort by ECOWAS to figure out how to manage this transition. But longer term, if there's no kind of resolution of these two different passport regimes that have been put in place, there could be expectations expectations of repatriation of migrants back, or higher bureaucratic hurdles that they need to pass in order to stay in country. Particular visa fees and length of residency that they need to demonstrate to be able to stay in country. So I know that many migrants from these countries are concerned about what this means for their own economic future, and as do investors in these three countries, wondering about the security of their investments in the long term.
All right, let's hear the same question from you, Dr. Iraki. Talking about migration and the fact that some Burkinabés and also Malians reside in Côte d'Ivoire, and this is all under the ECOWAS Freedom of Movement Protocol.
That's one of the biggest attractions for ECOWAS, that you can move from one ECOWAS country to another. You can go to study, you can go to work, you can get ideas from one country to another. But most important, those Burkinabe, those Malians who work in Ivory Coast or other ECOWAS countries, send remittances home. They could be jobless where they are. So the home country is going to feel the effect of this non-migration. Because those people, remember that the more you move from one country to another, the more you become innovative, the more you are able to come up with new ideas, the more your thinking is challenged. So by keeping those people at home instead of going to Ivory Coast or elsewhere, innovative capacity of ECOWAS is going to be reduced. People are going to share these ideas. So I think everybody is going to feel the effect, whether it is Ivory Coast that benefits from the creative ideas from the river of Malians and Burkinabés, or whether it is the people who get remittances from Ivory Coast back to Burkinabe. I can give you an example of Kenya or East Africa. We get a lot of remittances from US or from Europe. So when you stop that, the consumers in the home country, in Kenya and so on, feel the effect. Again, I'm still saying that these three countries leaving ECOWAS makes political sense, but does not make economic sense, whichever way you look at it.
Okay, Professor Iraki. Now, I know you did say that you wish, these three countries would actually reconsider their exit. And we also know that the ECOWAS has actually offered a transition period until July 2025 for a potential return. Now, Professor Iraki, are there likely economic shifts that may persuade the Alliance of Sahel states to consider, if at all?
That's an interesting question, because we don't know why they decided to leave. It was probably a political situation. But the only people who can make these three countries go back to ECOWAS are the citizens of these countries. If they realize that they are losing by leaving ECOWAS, they probably support their leaders or persuade their leaders to go back to ECOWAS. The only problem is that the three countries are not democratic. They are being ruled by people who got power undemocratically. So it's very hard for the citizens to force them or to persuade them to go back to ECOWAS. So the only option that I think that can work very well is for the members of ECOWAS, maybe big countries like Nigeria or Ghana, to talk to the leaders of these countries and convince them that it makes economic sense to go back to ECOWAS and resolve their plight. But I guess in the long run, it's not the leaders who are going to suffer. It is the ordinary citizens who are going to suffer if these three countries leave ECOWAS. But I think the leaders of ECOWAS can persuade those leaders to see economic sense and go back to the fold.
All right, let's quickly hear from Dr. Resnick on the same question, on the likely economic shifts that may persuade these three states to, return to ECOWAS. Are there any at all?
Well, I mean, we are living in a tremendous amount of global uncertainty at the moment, and so there certainly can be shocks on the horizon. If you think about, for instance, if the Russia-Ukraine war is resolved, that's definitely going to shift global food markets in significant ways, and have shocks that reverberate in West Africa. I think for these three countries, there's not going to be many positive shocks that will reaffirm their decision to have left. And many have, before they did this, raised the alarm bells that this was going to be economically painful. For the time being, at least, they have not left the CFA monetary zone, which would have been even, I think, more disastrous, really affect macroeconomic instability as well. So I think for the time being, even if prices are going up for basic foods, I don't see this really convincing these quite determined leaders to show that they're taking a stand against ECOWAS.
All right. Now, let's quickly take a breather. When we come back, we'll definitely continue this topic. Please stay with us. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with us. Still talking about how the exit of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso from the ECOWAS would affect trade. Thank you so much for staying with us, Professor Iraki and Dr. Resnick.
You're welcome.
All right, so Dr. Iraki, just before the break, Professor Iraki, I beg your pardon, just before the break, Dr. Resnick was talking about, these states or these countries still being in the CFA monitoring zone. And as we all know, they remain in the Francophone West African Economic and Monetary Union using the CFA franc as well. Now, how will their departure from ECOWAS influence broader debates over a unified currency? Dr. Resnick talked about how, these three states were still in CFA monitoring zone. So I was actually asking, how you feel that their departure from ECOWAS would influence broader debates over a unified currency.
I think one of my dreams is that one day Africa will have a common currency, like the euro, or the way we use the dollar. But that dreams to be deferred, because if there is CFA, that means you have more currencies to deal with. And the more currencies you deal with, the more expensive it becomes to trade. So once again, I see that as a step backward in terms of the dream of the Africa Free Trade Area, in terms of making trade easier to flow. I always get annoyed when I leave Kenya and I'm going to Ghana or Nigeria. I have to go to change the currency, change it back, rule the dollar, and so on. It becomes very expensive. So I think the fact that they are leaving CFA means that trade is going to become more expensive. And that is what we need to make trade between African countries smoother, having a single currency, the same way we use the dollar, the same way we use the euro. So I think it's, again, as I keep on saying, makes political sense, but does not make economic sense. So I wish they could again reconsider their decision. Okay.
Now, Dr. Resnick, there have been debates over, embedded political objectives, especially in trade deals, such as discussions around the African Growth and Opportunity Act. Now, in your expert's opinion, do you think that nations should sacrifice economic integration for political autonomy?
Well, I think there's two parts to that question. I mean, I think this is always a difficult balancing act. You see many countries are always trying to tread this tightrope between wanting to be more integrated, but not really having to sacrifice too much of their own sovereignty over decisions about, taxes and tariffs, for instance. Particularly when there is a crisis. Every time we have a food price crisis, we see countries that are supposed to be working towards integration, starting to put up export bans and import bans. So, I mean, I think if we're serious about integration, and if the African Union is serious about the African Continental Free Trade Area, then we obviously have to see political will to commit to concerted and coherent trade and tax policies, regardless of kind of national sovereignty goals.
Okay.
But there's another component in terms of thinking about whether different trade deals, including the African Growth and Opportunity Act between the U.S. and Africa, for instance, whether there should include political and governance conditionalities as part of being a member of those agreements. Mm. And I mention that because that was, of course, the big issue here in ECOWAS, that ECOWAS is not just a trade body, it's also a peace and security body. And there is the Democracy and Governance Protocol, which says that governments in ECOWAS should not accept unconstitutional means of coming to power, such as coups. Yeah. And so that's what precipitated this entire issue that we're in, is this challenge of balancing the democracy and governance goals with the trade integration goals.
Okay. Now, speaking of balance, Professor Iraki, there have been a dramatic fall in revenues at ports. I know earlier we did talk about the Tema and Lagos ports, but there have been dramatic falls in revenue at ports like the Cotonou and also the Dakar ports, after the sanctions. Now, what measures can be implemented in order to safeguard trade infrastructures against similar shocks in future?
The problem is that it's very hard to predict political decisions. I don't think anybody saw this Sahelexit, as we are calling it, big countries leaving with the ECOWAS. So while it is very hard to predict political decisions, I think it's always easy to prepare for political consequences. For example, I would probably expect the West African countries that have been trading with these big countries to think of how they can diversify transport systems. For example, if you have been having some goods and services going to Mali or going to other countries, instead of leaving the port empty, you may have to think of more trade with maybe neighboring countries. Maybe think of how you can get trade agreements with other African countries. But if one country leaves, the other one is working. I think one of the things that these countries need to do to make sure that their ports are not left empty is to make sure that they diversify their trade, so that you don't just rely on a few countries. There's no reason why these countries that are empty ports cannot trade with Kenya or with Nigeria or other countries. It's always good in the current world to diversify, so that you don't have only one trading partner. And there's nothing wrong with making sure that you don't put all your eggs in one basket. There's no limit to how extensive you can make your trade. I see Kenya trading with China, which is very far away. I see Nigeria trading with US, which is very far away. So I think it's a very good opportunity for these countries to see how they can extend their trade routes, they can come up with more trading partners, and they can diversify what passes through their ports. Expansion of trade to make sure that you can be able to adapt or to withstand such shocks might be one way to start, or one way to make sure that you don't go through such shocks in future.
All right, Professor Iraki talked about, investor confidence. He talks about diversifying trade and not having only one trading partner, and that's not putting all your eggs in one basket. Now, Dr. Resnick, let's talk about investor confidence. I did read somewhere that it has increased. Investor confidence in Africa has actually slightly increased. And we know that historically, ECOWAS's collective stability has actually attracted FDI. But do you think that the bloc's credibility can recover after losing these key members, especially when investor sentiment is already fragile?
Yes, I do think investor confidence can recover. I think the issue here was, ECOWAS did actually adhere to its principles and its protocols, lifted sanctions against these countries when, obviously the economic and humanitarian effects were becoming quite extreme. But I think, ECOWAS has proved in the past to be one of the stronger, more effective regional economic communities in the region, whether it's helped, intervene in civil wars in the region, whether it's helped to advance the economic and trade goals of the region. So I think for the remaining, countries in ECOWAS, I don't see any key reasons why investors would be deterred. I think it's really investor confidence in the AES countries that's going to be hit here.
Okay. Now, Professor Iraki, do you believe that, the fragmentation caused by the Sahelexit could weaken the region's ability to negotiate fair international food prices? I know you did talk about, how African countries should trade within themselves and even as they trade internationally. But do you think that it will weaken the region's ability to negotiate fair international food prices, thereby raising costs further?
That's an interesting question, because when these three countries leave ECOWAS, some people might interpret that ECOWAS is not working as expected. So people might see that as a weakness. But I think that should be interpreted as a strength. What the remaining ECOWAS countries should do is to improve the trading system, make sure that the volume of trade goes up. make sure there's more integration, so that these three countries that have failed to realize that they made a mistake. At the end of the day, it's only 16% of the population that has left. 84% of the population is still within ECOWAS. So I think if you look at the signaling effect, you may say that people might perceive that as a weakness. But if they put their house in order, they remember that charity starts at home, there's no way they cannot continue negotiating among themselves, other trading partners, European Union, US, China, and so on, to make sure that trade expands. And I believe that if they expand the trade, if they make sure that the living standards of the remaining members of ECOWAS improve, maybe these people who are leaving might come back. Remember that these three countries are moving away because they have certain minerals, certain strategic minerals.
Yeah.
But they must remember that you cannot be an island. You must trade with other people. We live in a multilateral world. We live in a global world. So you must trade with others. You must communicate with others. You must act as a group, because nobody can be successful by himself. We must always work with others within the framework of globalization, within the framework of multilateralism. So I think it might weaken, but in the long run, if they put their house in order, I see things improving.
Absolutely, Professor Iraki. Now, speaking of improving trading systems, Dr. Resnick, in a scenario where essential goods become increasingly expensive due to new tariffs, what role can innovation in local agriculture play in mitigating hunger?
Well, I mean, I think there's a few different roles. I mean, one that we saw just coming out of the crisis with Russia invading Ukraine and the spike in food prices was seeing countries like Nigeria investing more in their own fertilizer processing and distribution to reduce import costs of fertilizer overseas. We're seeing a lot of innovation in terms of new seeds that can be more resilient to climate change, to drought conditions. That's critically important. We're seeing the expansion of digital agricultural extension activities. So typically you used to have a whole group of extension agents who would have to go out and give advice to farmers, but increasingly with a lot of tech savvy in the West African region, you're seeing the development of new apps and other technologies to help farmers have immediate access to information when they're facing a pest infestation or facing a drought, et cetera. So I think you're seeing a lot of new innovation in the agricultural space in general, but specifically with some of the startup and entrepreneurial action in West Africa.
All right. Now, speaking of innovations, and technology, Professor Iraki, what role can technology and data analytics play, especially in monitoring supply chain disruptions and predicting food prices surges in a post-ECOWAS trade landscape?
I think there's no doubt that the future lies in technology, future lies in more data, the future lies in data analytics. So one of the innovations that I expect these countries to focus on is more use of technology. For example, I expect these countries to monitor the supply chain all the way from Ghana, all the way from Burkina Faso, all the way from Mali, so that they know where the value is added and where the value is lost. So I think there's no question about it that one way to make agriculture more productive is to use more technology. There have been resistance in Africa about the use of GMOs, the use of irrigation, the use of modern technologies that are probably more prevalent in the US or China or other countries. So I think Africa must be open to more innovation, must be open to more technologies. That's the only way to compete with others, and that's the only way we can do more with fewer resources. There's no question that Africa has a lot of arable land, but I think what is missing is innovation, that we can compete with the rest of the world, and very important, reduce the cost of food that we have just been talking about.
All right. Now, since we're about winding down, Dr. Resnick, earlier you did mention nutrition, and how some children in some countries in Africa are malnourished. Now, what parallels can be drawn from past instances of regional trade disintegration, and how can those lessons inform policy responses to counteract the dual challenges of soaring food costs and also malnutrition, especially when nearly 17 million children under 5 are already facing acute malnutrition?
Yeah, so this is an incredibly complex issue that I think the options have been narrowed a little bit by by this AES exit. I mean, if you think about the global food price crisis we had in 2008 and 2009, that was often worsened by what we call beggar thy neighbor policies, where every country began putting up their barriers to trade because they were concerned about losing food. Concerned about rising costs, and it really kind of worsened the situation. And of course, that is somewhat what we're seeing now with the rise in export tariffs and import tariffs between the ECOWAS and non-ECOWAS countries. I think what we also learned in those cases was the value of what I mentioned earlier was, strong social protection systems to help cushion consumers. As I mentioned earlier, things like school meals program for malnourished children, ensuring that you're bringing in fortified foods into those school programs. And there's a lot of pilot efforts, including in Nigeria, in Senegal, for fortified rice to maybe be integrated into school feeding programs to ensure children are getting access to key minerals and nutrients. So these social protection programs are kind of the best option. What we usually see governments do, though, is they also put price ceilings on certain goods. So, saying that rice or bread, shouldn't cost more than a certain amount of money. This helps consumers, but there are some knock-on effects then for processors, for producers of that bread, for instance, or for rice millers, for instance. So it's always needs to be a kind of a balancing act between protection for consumers and ensuring you're still creating incentives for investment for the domestic business community.
Absolutely, Dr. Resnick. Now, Professor Iraki, let's have your final thoughts.
I think the question of hunger in Africa really bothers me, because what I've noted is that Africa is not hungry because there's no food. So I think that's just a question of connecting the markets. You find that some parts of Africa have a lot of food, others have food deficit. But how do we connect them? So we need to start seeing hunger in Africa as not just an isolated case, but it is integrated to things like technology. It's integrated to things like trade. It is integrated to things like data. So let's also have homegrown solutions so that Africa does not suffer hunger. Because as we say in most parts of Africa, a hungry person is an angry person. Absolutely. And we don't want hungry and angry people in Africa. We have solutions for that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor XN Iraki, economist, University of Nairobi, for joining us on the conversation, and also Dr. Danielle Resnick, Senior Research Fellow, Markets and Trade and Institutions Unit, International Food Policy Research Institute, for joining us on the conversation. We really, really appreciate you for your time.